It was supposed to be a night of elegance, charity and music, a gala to raise funds for a cause that meant so much to so many. The venue was grand, the guests were wealthy and influential, and the air was filled with the sound of light chatter, clinking glasses, and the soft strains of a live orchestra. Jasmine, a 12-year-old black girl, stood in the corner of the room wearing a simple black dress, ready to serve drinks and make sure the guests were comfortable. Her family had struggled for as long as she could remember, and tonight she was working as a waitress at this fancy event, just like any other night. But little did she know, her world was about to be turned upside down. The man who would change everything was Mr. Hawkins, a well-dressed, middle-aged man in his 50s, known for his wealth and arrogance. He was holding court at a table with his friends, laughing too loudly and making everyone around him uncomfortable with his boisterous attitude. But then, as if bored by the chatter, Mr. Hawkins turned his attention to Jasmine. "Hey, you!" he called out, his voice cutting through the ambient noise. Jasmine froze, her heart racing. She wasn't used to being singled out, especially not by someone like him. She turned slowly, trying to keep her face composed. "Yes, sir," she responded, trying to sound confident despite the nervousness in her stomach. Mr. Hawkins leaned back in his chair with a smirk. "I hear you can play the piano. I think it's time you show us what you've got." His voice was laced with mockery, his eyes gleaming with a challenge. Jasmine's breath caught in her throat. She had played the piano since she was little, but it had always been a private escape for her, something she did alone, away from the world. Never before had she been asked to perform in front of an audience, let alone one that included people like Mr. Hawkins. She felt a lump form in her throat and her palms began to sweat. I'm not sure. I'm here to work, sir," she stammered, hoping he would let her off the hook, but Mr. Hawkins wasn't having it. "Come on, don't be shy. We're all here for entertainment, right? Play something for us, or else I'll be forced to report you for wasting time." The room grew quieter as people turned to look. Jasmine's heart pounded in her chest, and she could feel her face turning red. The pressure was mounting, and she had no way out. She had no choice but to walk to the grand piano sitting at the side of the room. With each step she took toward the piano, her nerves worsened. How could she play in front of all these people, especially in front of someone like Mr. Hawkins, who had already made it clear that he was there to humiliate her? The humiliation of playing the piano in front of him seemed unbearable, but what choice did she have? Her hands shook as she sat at the piano, the weight of the room's attention on her. The pressure was suffocating, but something inside her told her to keep going. She couldn't back down now. She placed her fingers on the keys, feeling the cold ivory beneath her fingertips. Jasmine closed her eyes for a moment, trying to calm herself, trying to remember why she loved playing the piano in the first place. Music had always been her refuge, a way to express herself when words failed, and now more than ever it felt like her only way out. "Go ahead, play. Let's see what you've got," Mr. Hawkins taunted from the back of the room, the sound of his voice dripping with arrogance. Jasmine took a deep breath. She couldn't let him win. She couldn't let him break her. Not now. The first note rang out, sharp and clear, cutting through the tension in the room. The crowd fell silent as Jasmine's fingers danced across the keys. Slowly the music began to flow, and with it Jasmine's nerves began to settle. Each note she played felt like a small victory, a triumph over the fear that had gripped her only moments before. But as she played, Jasmine realized something. The more she played, the more the crowd's reactions shifted. What started as an uncomfortable silence began to evolve into something else, something powerful. Her music was no longer just for Mr. Hawkins or the crowd. It was for her, and for the first time in a long time, Jasmine felt truly free. What would happen next? Would Jasmine's talent be enough to prove herself and shut down the humiliation, or would Mr. Hawkins's challenge break her? Stay tuned for the next chapter. But before you do, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Your support helps us bring you more stories like this one. Jasmine's fingers continued to glide across the piano keys, each note ringing louder than the last, as if they were pushing through the tension in the room. The soft murmurs of the crowd faded into a distant hum, and all she could hear was the music she had spent so many years perfecting. She didn't know how much time had passed or how long she had been playing, but she was no longer aware of the sneering gaze of Mr. Hawkins or the prying eyes of the guests. Music had always been her escape, her secret world. Since she was a little girl, she had found solace in the keys of the piano. It was the one place where she felt in control, the one place where she could express her feelings without fear of judgment. In the small, cramped living room of their apartment, with a second-hand keyboard her mother had bought on sale, Jasmine would lose herself for hours, playing songs her mother loved and some she had learned on her own. Her mother, Olivia, was her greatest inspiration. Olivia had always encouraged her to pursue her love of music, despite the difficulties they faced. They didn't have much, living paycheck to paycheck, scraping by, but Olivia always found a way to make things work. She worked long hours at a local diner, coming home late and still finding the energy to listen to Jasmine practice. Even when Jasmine doubted herself, her mother never did. "You've got something special, Jasmine. I can feel it," Olivia would say, her eyes full of pride even when the bills were stacked high and their refrigerator was empty. But despite her mother's belief in her, Jasmine had always felt like something was missing. She dreamed of attending a music school, learning from the best and playing on grand stages. But that dream seemed impossible when she was stuck in a cycle of work and survival, helping her mother pay the bills and taking care of their small apartment. Every time she sat at the piano, she couldn't help but wonder if she'd ever get the chance to make her dreams a reality. Then, of course, there was the pain of being different. Jasmine often found herself the only black girl in the rooms where she played. She loved her heritage, loved the strength and resilience it had given her, but sometimes the world didn't seem to care about those things. Sometimes the world made her feel small and insignificant, as if her worth was measured by the color of her skin rather than her talent. Now, as she played at the gala, in front of a room full of people who saw her as nothing more than a servant, she felt her insecurities resurface. She wasn't sure if they saw her talent or just a little girl who didn't belong in their world. She wasn't sure if they were even listening to the music or just waiting for her to fail. But then she saw something unexpected. As she played, she noticed the subtle shift in the room, the whispers, the stares, the smirks from Mr. Hawkins slowly faded, replaced by soft murmurs of admiration. The guests were leaning forward, eyes fixed on her. They were no longer watching out of curiosity or judgment, but out of genuine interest. And there, in that moment, Jasmine realized something. She had their attention. Her music, her passion, was breaking through the barriers they had placed around her. She felt the melody take over her, and for the first time, she wasn't worried about what they thought of her. She played for herself. She played for the girl, who had spent years dreaming of a chance to show her worth, and for the woman who believed in her no matter how hard life became. She played for her mother, who had always told her that her dreams were worth fighting for. As the final note hung in the air, Jasmine took a deep breath and opened her eyes. The room was silent, an almost surreal quiet that enveloped her. She had done it. But then there was the applause. It was slow at first, hesitant, as if the guests weren't quite sure if they had witnessed what they thought they had. But as the seconds ticked by, the applause grew louder, stronger. Jasmine's heart raced, but not from fear this time. The sound of clapping filled her with a warmth she hadn't expected. She had been heard. From the back of the room, Mr. Hawkins' face was unreadable. His smug expression had faded, replaced with an almost stunned silence. Jasmine couldn't help but notice how his eyes lingered on her for a moment longer than she expected, his posture now less confident, less arrogant. For a fleeting moment, Jasmine felt like she had won. But even as the crowd continued to applaud, Jasmine's mind raced. Was this it? Would this be enough to prove herself? Could one song really change everything? What did it mean for her? Would she be stuck here, trapped, in the same routine of waiting tables? Or would this moment lead to something greater? The night had only just begun, but Jasmine felt a shift within herself. She wasn't just the girl in the black dress, serving drinks to the guests. She was someone worth paying attention to. She had something to offer. And for the first time, she believed that maybe, just maybe, her dreams weren't as far out of reach as they once seemed. But how would the rest of the night unfold? Stay tuned to find out. The applause began to die down, and for a moment, Jasmine allowed herself to feel proud. It was brief, though, because as soon as the last claps echoed through the room, she felt the weight of Mr. Hawkins's gaze again. His eyes weren't filled with admiration. Instead, there was something colder there, something calculating. Jasmine could feel the tension rising between them. She stood up from the piano, her hands trembling slightly from the emotional release of playing, but she quickly wiped them on her dress, forcing herself to stay composed. Her eyes darted across the room, and for the first time she noticed something she hadn't before. The guests were no longer ignoring her. They were looking at her with something new. Respect, maybe, or curiosity. But Mr. Hawkins, his gaze, was not one of respect. It was one of challenge. He wasn't about to let this go. Before she could take a step back toward the service table, Mr. Hawkins stood up and clapped his hands loudly, drawing even more attention to himself. "Well, well, well," he said with a sneer, his voice ringing out above the murmurs of the crowd. "It seems like we have a little star on our hands, huh?" Jasmine's stomach churned. She could tell by the way he spoke that he wasn't impressed, in a way that meant something positive. No, he was mocking her, he was playing his game, and she was his target. "You all saw it," Mr. Hawkins continued, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "The little girl who thought she could play the piano like a real artist." He let out a loud laugh, and the room awkwardly followed his cue, unsure of how to respond. "But can she really play? Can she play something worthy of this crowd, or is she just a one-hit wonder?" Jasmine stood frozen, the smile that had crept onto her face moments ago now evaporating. She had hoped that maybe, just maybe, this performance would put her on a different path, that it would be enough to be seen as someone with real talent, someone who belonged. But Mr. Hawkins was making sure that didn't happen. "Go on, kid," he taunted. "Show us your stuff. What else have you got?" He waved a dismissive hand as if daring her to prove him wrong. Jasmine's mind raced. She couldn't afford to let him break her, not now, not after everything she'd just fought for. But the pressure was suffocating. The weight of the room, all eyes on her again, felt unbearable. Her thoughts drifted back to her mother. Olivia had always told her that she had something special, that she could rise above the noise and prove everyone wrong. But how could she do that now, in front of these people who were clearly looking for her to fail? She took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. Her fingers still tingled from the piano keys, but she felt paralyzed, unsure of whether she could face the humiliation Mr. Hawkins seemed to be setting up for her. Mr. Hawkins noticed her hesitation and seized the opportunity. "What? Cat got your tongue?" he jeered. "I thought you could play." Jasmine's hands clenched into fists at her sides, and something inside her snapped. The ridicule, the doubts, the years of feeling invisible, all of it came rushing back. No, she wasn't going to let him do this. Not to her, not after everything. With a sudden, sharp motion, Jasmine walked back to the piano, her heels clicking on the polished floor, each step feeling like a declaration of her refusal to back down. She didn't know what she was going to play yet, but she knew one thing. She wasn't going to be humiliated. As she sat down at the piano again, she could feel the gaze of the room on her, some full of expectation, some with skepticism. Her fingers hovered over the keys as she gathered herself. Her heart raced, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from a fire she hadn't realized was there until now. Jasmine's eyes locked with Mr. Hawkins for a brief moment. There was no mistaking the challenge in his eyes. He wanted to break her. He wanted to see her fail. But in that moment, something inside her hardened. Not today. With one smooth motion, she began to play. The first note was soft, tentative, but it built. The music poured from her, rising with a clarity and power she hadn't realized she was capable of. She let her fingers speak for her, filling the room with a melody that was both raw and intricate. It was a piece she had learned years ago, one her mother had always loved, a composition full of passion, sadness, and hope. As the music swirled around her, Jasmine allowed herself to feel it, to lose herself in it. She wasn't playing for anyone else. She was playing for herself, for the girl who had been told she wasn't enough, for the woman who had always believed in her for every moment when the world tried to silence her, The room fell into a hush again, but this time, the silence wasn't awkward. It wasn't judgmental, it was respectful. The music had taken over. When Jasmine finally stopped, the last note hung in the air, the silence so thick you could feel it. For a long moment, no one spoke. No one moved. It was as if the entire room was holding its breath. Then Mr. Hawkins broke the silence, but this time his tone was different, something akin to uncertainty. "Well, I didn't see that coming," he muttered under his breath, but it wasn't enough to mask the slight tremor in his voice. Jasmine stood up slowly, her heart still racing, but there was a glimmer of something else now. It wasn't fear, it was empowerment. She had done it. She had stood up to him. She had shown him and everyone else in that room that she wasn't just a waitress. She wasn't just a girl who could be easily overlooked. Jasmine was someone who could stand her ground, someone who had a talent that could not be ignored. But as the guests began to applaud again, Jasmine knew this was far from over. There was still a battle to fight, and she had just begun. What would happen next? Would Mr. Hawkins find another way to undermine her? Or would this moment mark the beginning of a new chapter for Jasmine? Keep following the story to find out. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a twist in this incredible journey. The applause echoed through the hall, but it wasn't the kind of applause Jasmine had imagined. It wasn't the warm, genuine appreciation that she had secretly hoped for. No, this applause was filled with uncertainty, the kind of polite clapping you give when you're unsure how to respond to something unexpected. Jasmine stood at the piano, her heart still pounding in her chest, trying to steady her breath. She could feel Mr. Hawkins' eyes on her, even though she wasn't looking directly at him. There was something unsettling in his gaze, something colder than before, like he was calculating his next move. She had defied him. And now she knew he wasn't going to let that slide. Her fingers still tingled from the last notes she played, but her body was starting to feel the exhaustion from the emotional and mental weight of the situation. She had thought that by playing beautifully, by showing her true talent, she would earn their respect. But it wasn't as simple as that, was it? "Interesting," Mr. Hawkins said slowly, standing up from his seat. His voice was smooth, but there was a sharp edge to it now. "You're certainly talented, but that doesn't mean you belong here." Jasmine's blood ran cold at his words, but she refused to let him see her flinch. She had fought so hard to get to this moment, and now, just when she thought she had earned her place, he was trying to tear it away from her. "You think playing the piano is going to change things?" he continued, striding closer to her. "This isn't your world, it never will be. You're just a little girl who got lucky." The words hit her like a punch in the gut. The anger rose in her chest, but she kept it contained, locking her emotions away. She couldn't afford to let him see her vulnerable. Not now, but she didn't have to say anything. His words were being met with murmurs from the other guests, and for the first time since she had started playing, the tension in the room was palpable. Jasmine could sense the change. She could see it in their eyes. Their doubt was beginning. Did a shift into something else? Maybe they hadn't fully realized what had just happened. Maybe they didn't know how to reconcile the girl they had seen as just a waitress with the musician who had just stunned them with her talent. She didn't have to fight him alone, and she wasn't going to. Before she could respond, a voice cut through the air, strong, firm, and surprisingly supportive. "I think you've said enough, Mr. Hawkins." Jasmine turned in surprise, her eyes landing on Mrs. Jennings, the organizer of the event. Mrs. Jennings was a tall, regal woman in her mid-40s, known for her sharp mind and no-nonsense attitude. Jasmine had noticed her earlier in the night, gliding through the room with the grace of someone who was used to being in control. Mrs. Jennings wasn't someone who tolerated disrespect, and in that moment, it seemed like she wasn't going to tolerate Mr. Hawkins either. The guests in the room fell silent. Mr. Hawkins blinked, clearly taken aback by her words. "Excuse me?" he asked, his voice a mix of surprise and annoyance. "You heard me," Mrs. Jennings said, her gaze hard as steel. "This is a fundraising event, not a place for you to belittle people. Jasmine just played something beautiful, something you clearly weren't expecting. If you can't appreciate that, then perhaps you should reconsider your place here." There was a sharp intake of breath from the room, and for the first time that night, people seemed to shift uncomfortably. Some were nodding in agreement, others glancing around as if unsure of how to react. But it was clear that Mrs. Jennings had turned the tide. The power had shifted away from Mr. Hawkins, and now all eyes were on him. Jasmine's heart lifted at the sight of the support. It wasn't much, just a few words, but in that moment, it was everything. Mrs. Jennings wasn't just standing up for Jasmine. She was standing up for the idea that talent, dignity, and respect weren't bound by status, wealth, or background. Mr. Hawkins didn't respond immediately. He stood there for a moment, his face red with indignation, his mind clearly racing for a comeback. But the room wasn't on his side anymore. Slowly he turned away, muttering something under his breath as he walked back to his table. The tension in the room eased, but not completely. Jasmine could feel the weight of every single guest's eyes still on her, but this time it was different. This wasn't the same scrutiny she'd felt when she had first walked into the room. This wasn't the judgment of someone waiting for her to fail. This was a new kind of attention, a kind of respect, perhaps, or maybe just curiosity about who she really was. Mrs. Jennings walked over to Jasmine, a soft smile playing on her lips. "You are amazing," she said, her voice warm but calm. "You have a gift, Jasmine. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Jasmine nodded, her voice catching in her throat. She wanted to thank Mrs. Jennings, to say something in response, but words failed her. She had never expected anyone to defend her like that. Not here, not in a room full of strangers who saw her as nothing more than a servant. Before she could say anything, Mrs. Jennings placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Keep playing. Don't let him or anyone else distract you from your dream. You have more than just a talent, you have a purpose." Jasmine's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment she had to blink them away. This moment was a turning point, she knew it. She didn't know where it would lead, but she was beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, this night could change everything. She walked back to the piano, taking a deep breath. This time, it wasn't just about proving anything to anyone. It wasn't about impressing the room or shutting Mr. Hawkins down. This time, it was about playing for herself. She sat down at the piano once more, her fingers touching the cool keys, and for the second time that night, the music began to flow. But this time, Jasmine wasn't playing to survive. She was playing to thrive. What would happen next? Would Jasmine find the strength to stay true to her path, or would the pressures of the night pull her back into the shadows? Don't miss the next chapter to find out. And if you're loving this story, don't forget to subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments below. Jasmine's fingers danced across the piano keys once more, but this time there was a different energy behind her music. It wasn't out of fear or the need to impress. It wasn't about showing Mr. Hawkins or anyone in the room that she was worthy. It was simply about expressing herself, the music flowing from her like a river that had been held back for too long. As she played, she could feel the tension in the room slowly melting away, replaced by something more profound, a collective understanding that transcended the walls between the performers and the audience. The sound of the piano filled the air with a sweet, haunting melody, something deeply personal, yet universally relatable. It was a piece that had always brought her peace, one that had helped her through the toughest times. Jasmine allowed herself to lose herself in the music, her head tilting slightly as she closed her eyes. She could still feel the eyes of the guests on her, but now it didn't matter. She wasn't playing for approval anymore, she was playing for her own soul. The room was quieter than before, and Jasmine could hear the rustle of fabric as the guests shifted uncomfortably. She was no longer the invisible girl in the corner. Now she was the focal point, the girl who had taken a stand. But amidst the silence, there was one voice that stood out, one person who had something important to say. It was a voice Jasmine hadn't expected to hear. "Ladies and gentlemen," came the deep, steady voice of Mr. Thompson, an older man with a greying beard and an air of authority. He was a local philanthropist and one of the main sponsors of the charity event. "I think it's time we had a conversation about what we truly value in this room." Jasmine paused her playing for a brief second, surprised. Mr. Thompson wasn't known for speaking up at events. He was usually a quiet observer, content to donate his money without drawing attention to himself. But tonight, something had changed. "I've been to many fundraisers," Mr. Thompson continued, his voice rising slightly to command attention. "And I've seen all the same faces, the same names, the same people who think they are entitled to the spotlight. But what makes tonight different is that we're witnessing something real, something raw. This young lady," he gestured toward Jasmine, "is showing us what talent, determination, and heart look like. And we'd be foolish to let anyone diminish that." Jasmine's breath caught in her throat. She had heard Mr. Thompson's name before. He was a prominent figure in the community, someone whose endorsement could open doors she never thought possible. His words were powerful, and they carried weight. And now he was defending her. The room was silent. She could feel the shift, the discomfort of some of the guests who had aligned themselves with Mr. Hawkins, now feeling the weight of their choices. They had witnessed an act of kindness, of integrity, and they couldn't ignore it. "We've been caught up in the wrong narrative for far too long," Mr. Thompson continued. "We judge people by where they come from, what they have, and who they know. But Jasmine here just showed us that the real value of a person comes from what's in here," he pointed to his chest, "and what they're willing to give to the world." Jasmine's heart swelled with gratitude. The tears that had threatened to spill earlier now came rushing forward. She quickly wiped them away, not wanting to lose control, but the overwhelming sense of validation was too much. Thompson turned toward Mr. Hawkins, whose face had flushed a deep shade of red. "And as for you," Mr. Thompson said, his voice now cold and unyielding, "I suggest you think long and hard about how you've treated people in this room. We're here to lift each other up, not tear them down." Jasmine could see Mr. Hawkins, seething, his fists clenched at his sides. But he knew better than to argue now. He knew he had been beaten not by Jasmine, but by the collective force of the people who stood with her. A few moments of awkward silence passed before Mrs. Jennings stepped forward once more, her eyes flashing with determination. She had seen what had just unfolded, how Mr. Hawkins had tried to belittle Jasmine, and how the crowd had turned on him. "I think we all need to remember why we're here," Mrs. Jennings said, her tone carrying the authority of someone who had organized the event with heart and soul. "This is about the cause we're supporting, the children who will benefit from the funds raised tonight. And it's about the music, the art, and the talent that make this world a better place. Jasmine's performance tonight isn't just a display of skill. It's a reminder that no one should be judged by their circumstances. We all have something to offer, something that deserves to be seen and heard." Jasmine felt a fire ignite within her. It wasn't just the words of Mrs. Jennings or Mr. Thompson. It was the energy in the room, the support that was beginning to pour in. The tide had shifted. No longer was she the invisible girl. No longer would she be dismissed. Tonight, she had proven her worth, not just as a performer, but as someone who belonged. As the applause began to roll in again, it was different this time. There was a sense of admiration, of respect, and maybe, just maybe, even a little bit of awe. Jasmine stood tall, her chest rising with each round of applause, her heart full, her spirit renewed. It wasn't over yet, but she had won something tonight. It wasn't just the approval of the room, it was her own self-respect. The validation she had been yearning for from the moment she had stepped onto that stage had finally come. But she knew this was just the beginning. What came next would be even more important. She had proven herself once tonight, but she couldn't rest on her laurels. There were still battles ahead, and she was ready for them. Would this newfound support be enough to keep Jasmine moving forward? Or would the world try to drag her back down again? Don't miss the next chapter to find out what happens next. And if you've been moved by Jasmine's story, be sure to subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. The applause finally faded, but the energy in the room didn't. Jasmine sat back down at the piano, her fingers resting lightly on the keys, feeling the cool wood beneath her palms. The room felt different now. It wasn't just the energy that had shifted, it was the understanding. The whispers had subsided, the stares weren't as judgmental, and even though the tension wasn't entirely gone, Jasmine could feel something she had never felt before, the promise of change. But the question that lingered in her mind was, at what cost? As she stood, taking a small bow, the applause continued, but she could hear the underlying uncertainty in the room. People were clapping because they had to, because they now saw her. as someone worth recognizing. But how long would that last? How long before they remembered that she wasn't supposed to belong in spaces like this? Mrs. Jennings approached her again, this time with a more serious expression. Her smile had faded, slightly, replaced by a hint of concern. "Jasmine," she said softly, "you were incredible tonight, but there's something you need to know. This battle isn't over, and the next few days, they could be challenging." Jasmine nodded, her stomach tightening. She could already feel the weight of the situation settling in. The support had been overwhelming, but she wasn't naive. She knew that for every ally, there were those who would quietly resent her, those who might not show their true feelings, but would work in the shadows to undermine her. "Mr. Hawkins won't let this go," Mrs. Jennings continued, her voice low. "He's got power, connections, and a reputation to protect. I'm afraid he'll find a way to make things difficult for you. But Jasmine, I want you to know you're not alone. If you need anything, you let me know. I'll do whatever I can." Jasmine felt a knot form in her throat. The idea that this night, which should have been a victory, could come with so much baggage unsettled her. She had known that success wasn't always easy, but she hadn't expected to have to fight so hard just to exist in a space where she had every right to be. Mrs. Jennings smiled gently, sensing Jasmine's thoughts. "The road won't be smooth, but remember, this is just the beginning. You've shown everyone here tonight what you're capable of. The next step is to make sure they don't forget it." Jasmine appreciated her words, but doubt crept in. What if it wasn't enough? What if Mr. Hawkins had the power to erase everything she'd worked for, to make people forget? The fear was tangible, creeping into her thoughts like a dark shadow. The idea of fighting a battle that might not be winnable was terrifying. "Thank you, Mrs. Jennings," Jasmine whispered, finding comfort in the older woman's words. "I won't forget what you said." Before Mrs. Jennings could respond, the door to the room opened, and in walked a few of the other guests from the event. They were all smiles, clapping her on the back and congratulating her. But despite their warm greetings, Jasmine could tell they were still unsure. They had applauded her, but the doubt was still there. She wasn't one of them, and she could feel it in the air. One of them, a well-dressed man in his 40s with a slick haircut and a smug grin, approached her. He was one of the sponsors, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "You were good," he said, his tone patronizing. "I mean, for someone like you." Jasmine clenched her fists under the table, resisting the urge to snap at him. She could already feel the weight of his condescension. "Someone like you," the phrase haunted her. "Thank you," she said tightly, forcing herself to smile. "I'm glad you liked it." His smile faltered slightly, clearly unsure of how to react to her calm demeanor. "Yeah, well, it's good to see talent in unexpected places. Don't get me wrong, you've got skill. But this isn't the kind of thing you do full-time, right?" Jasmine's chest tightened, but she forced herself to stay composed. She had come too far to let a comment like that get to her. "I'm just getting started," she said, her voice firm, "and I plan to keep going." He raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "Well, good luck with that." The interaction left Jasmine feeling even more isolated, the doubt from Mr. Hawkins' words creeping into her mind again. She wasn't supposed to be here. She wasn't supposed to be one of them. But she refused to back down. Not now. Not after everything she had worked for. As the night wore on, the guests slowly began to trickle out, the event winding down. Mrs. Jennings had been right. Things wouldn't be easy. But the night wasn't without its victories. Despite the doubts, despite the challenges, she had earned a place in their minds. She had proven herself, at least for now. Still, Jasmine couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Her storm, the calm before the real battle. As she walked out of the event hall, heading toward the parking lot where her ride awaited, she felt a mix of emotions, pride, exhaustion, but also a gnawing sense of uncertainty. She had proven her worth in front of a crowd of people who had once viewed her as invisible, but now the hard work was just beginning. The night had been a victory, but victory wasn't always enough. The price of standing tall was steep, and Jasmine could only wonder how high the cost would be when the world came for her. Will Jasmine continue to rise above the challenges that await her, or will she be forced to confront the forces that are trying to tear her down? The next few days were a blur. Jasmine tried to keep her head down, focusing on her music, but the weight of what had happened at the charity event was still hanging over her. She had proven herself that night. There was no denying that, but as time passed, Jasmine couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond her reach. Every time she walked into school, she felt eyes on her. It wasn't the usual looks of indifference or mild curiosity. It was different. People were watching her more closely now, whispering behind their hands. Her performance at the fundraiser had made waves, but it also brought her unwanted attention. Some of it was positive, yes, but there were also those who resented her for taking up space, for being a black girl who played the piano with a passion and precision that even many adults couldn't match. Jasmine had seen that look in their eyes before, the kind of look that told her they didn't think she belonged. At first it was just a few comments from the usual suspects, those who felt threatened by someone who didn't fit into their version of the world. But Jasmine could feel the tension building. It was like the storm clouds had gathered, and she was standing right in their path. The first real sign came during lunch. She was sitting with a few friends, people who had supported her quietly since she started playing, and they were talking about school projects and music when a familiar voice cut through the chatter. Well, if it isn't the piano prodigy herself. Jasmine looked up to find Amber, a girl who had always made it clear she didn't like Jasmine, walking toward her with her usual smug smile. Amber was popular, and with that came a certain kind of power. Jasmine had never understood why Amber had a problem with her. She had always been polite, kept to herself, and never made a fuss. But for some reason, Amber seemed determined to make her life harder. Amber stopped just short of the table, her arms crossed. "I hear you made quite an impression at that charity event," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Too bad I don't think it's going to make a difference. You're still just you, right?" Jasmine felt her stomach tighten, but she didn't let Amber see how much the words stung. Instead, she lifted her chin, trying to keep her composure. "I'm proud of what I did," Jasmine replied calmly. "And I'm not letting anyone's opinion stop me." Amber snorted. "Well, good luck with that. I'm sure you'll need it. People like you don't just waltz into these things and expect to be accepted. You don't have the right look. You don't belong in those circles. You can't just play a few keys and expect them to take you seriously." Jasmine's hands tightened into fists under the table. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, but she didn't let her anger show. She knew Amber was just trying to provoke her, to get a reaction, but she wasn't going to give her the satisfaction. "Maybe you're right," Jasmine said, her voice low but steady. "Maybe I don't belong in the circles you run in, but that doesn't mean I don't belong somewhere." Amber's eyes narrowed as she took a step closer, her voice lowering to a whisper that only Jasmine could hear. "We'll see about that. People like you. You don't get to make a name for yourself. Trust me, someone will make sure of it." The threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Jasmine could feel her heart pounding in her chest, but she refused to show any fear. She wasn't going to let Amber or anyone else intimidate her. Amber turned on her heel and walked away, but Jasmine could feel the weight of her words. Someone will make sure of it. What did that mean? Who was Amber talking about? And why did Jasmine feel like it wasn't just an empty threat? The rest of the day passed in a blur of whispered comments and uneasy glances. Jasmine tried to focus on her classes, but the feeling that something was wrong refused to go away. Every time she turned a corner or entered a room, she felt eyes on her, and not the kind of eyes that were admiring or curious. No, these eyes were full of disdain, full of judgment. It was like the world was closing in around her. At home, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Even in the quiet of her bedroom, with the door closed and her music playing softly in the background, there was an unease that wouldn't go away. She'd always been the girl who could lose herself in her music, who could let it take her to a place of peace. But now the music felt different. It felt like a temporary escape, a way to block out the pressure, but it wasn't enough. The next morning, things escalated. Jasmine arrived at school early, hoping to get some practice in before classes started. As she made her way down the hallway, she passed a group of students who were gathered by the lockers, gossiping as usual. One of them, a tall boy named Tyler, caught her eye. He was the one who usually kept to himself, and Jasmine hadn't ever had much interaction with him. But today, when he saw her, his expression changed. His eyes widened, and for a moment he looked scared. He quickly turned away, whispering something to the girl next to him. Jasmine felt her stomach drop. She didn't know what to make of it. What was going on? She tried to shake off the feeling as she headed toward the music room, but the unease only grew. It wasn't just a few people now. It was starting to feel like the entire school was turning against her, like they were all in on some secret she wasn't privy to. She had no idea who or what was behind it, but she could feel the storm gathering. That afternoon, when Jasmine checked her phone, she saw a new message. It was from Mrs. Jennings, and her heart skipped a beat as she read it. Jasmine, I'm hearing disturbing things. Mr. Hawkins is making calls. Be careful. Don't trust anyone who's acting overly friendly. He's a powerful man and his influence runs deep. Jasmine felt a cold chill run down her spine. Mr. Hawkins wasn't done with her, and now it seemed like he was using his power to make sure she never had a chance at a future. What was Mr. Hawkins planning, and how far would he go to ruin Jasmine's life? Jasmine's world had shifted from one of possibility to one of constant vigilance. Every time she stepped out of her house, she felt eyes on her, whispering behind her back, waiting for her to falter. It wasn't just the students at school anymore. It was everyone, her friends, the teachers, the people at the store. Jasmine felt like a target, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep her composure. She had learned to ignore the whispers, to keep her head high, but it was harder now. Harder with every passing day. Every moment felt like an opportunity for someone to find a new way to remind her that she didn't belong. The worst part was that Jasmine wasn't just worried about herself anymore. She could feel the weight of her family's hopes and expectations pressing down on her too. Her mother had always believed in her, had always told her she could achieve anything, but even she had started to notice the change in Jasmine. Her once confident daughter had become withdrawn, quieter, hesitant. One evening, as Jasmine sat at the kitchen table trying to focus on her homework, her mother, Carla, came in, looking concerned. "Jasmine," she began softly, sitting down across from her. "What's going on with you? You've been distant lately. Is something happening at school? You know you can talk to me about anything." Jasmine didn't want to worry her mother. She didn't want to admit how hard things had become, how much she was struggling with the constant pressure. But she knew her mother could see through her facade. Carla had always known her better than anyone else. "I'm fine, Mom," Jasmine replied, her voice a little too shaky. "Just school stuff, you know. It's stressful." Her mother reached out, taking Jasmine's hand in her own. "Sweetheart, I know you're strong, but you don't have to carry all of this on your own. Whatever it is, we'll face it together, okay?" Jasmine felt her heart break a little at her mother's words. She had always felt like the one who needed to protect her family, to make them proud. But now she couldn't help but feel like she was dragging them down with her into a world that was becoming increasingly hostile. I don't know if I can keep doing this, Mom," Jasmine admitted, her voice trembling. "I'm trying, but it's like everything's falling apart. There are people at school, some of the teachers even, who look at me like I don't belong, like I don't deserve to be there, and I don't know how much longer I can take it." Carla squeezed her hand, her eyes soft with concern. "Jasmine, you are more than enough. You belong wherever you choose to be. Those people, they don't define you. You've worked so hard to get where you are, and if there's one thing I know about you, it's that you're not going to let anyone take that from you." But as comforting as her mother's words were, they didn't stop the fear that had taken root deep inside Jasmine. She had seen the power Mr. Hawkins wielded at the fundraiser. She had felt the icy weight of his gaze, the subtle threats hidden behind his polite smile. And now, with the whispers and tension growing at school, Jasmine couldn't shake the feeling that he was the one pulling the strings, using his influence to make sure she never made it. She didn't know how far he would go, but she was starting to feel like he would stop at nothing to tear her down. The next day, the pressure was unbearable. When Jasmine arrived at school, she found a note in her locker. It was handwritten with messy scrawl that made her skin crawl. "We know what you did. You don't belong. Keep your distance. This is your only warning." Her heart dropped as she read the words. It was a clear message, and it sent a chill through her. The idea that someone, someone who was so clearly connected to Mr. Hawkins, was trying to intimidate her, was enough to make her stomach turn. This wasn't just about jealousy or rivalry anymore. This was personal. Jasmine's hands shook as she crumpled the note and stuffed it into her bag. She wanted to scream, to confront whoever had written it, but she knew better. That would only make things worse. So she held it in. She stuffed her anger deep inside and tried to focus on getting through the day. But the note wasn't the only thing that would test her resolve. At lunch, when she sat down with her usual group of friends, Amber appeared again, flanked by a few of her followers. Jasmine braced herself, ready for the usual taunts, but what happened next was far worse. Amber smiled, but it wasn't a smile of malice. It was a smile of victory. She leaned down to Jasmine's level, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "You're really something, aren't you?" Amber said. "You think you've proven yourself, but there's a lot more you don't know. You're messing with people you shouldn't be messing with." Jasmine's heart raced, but she kept her voice steady. "What are you talking about?" Amber's smile widened, and for a moment, Jasmine saw a flicker of something dark in her eyes. "Let's just say you're not the only one who knows how to play the game, and you'll learn soon enough that you can't fight everyone, no matter how talented you are." With that, Amber turned and walked away, leaving Jasmine frozen in place. Her mind raced. What did that mean? What was Amber trying to say? Later that day, Jasmine received another text from Mrs. Jennings. "Jasmine, I've been trying to reach you. There's been talk about Mr. Hawkins. He's making moves behind the scenes. I'm not sure what's coming, but I want you to be prepared. You need to stay strong and don't let anyone convince you that you don't deserve your place." Jasmine felt the weight of the words pressed down on her. The storm was coming, and she didn't know how much longer she could stand tall under. The pressure. What would happen next? Would Jasmine give in to the pressure, or would she rise above the forces working against her? The days following the threatening notes and ominous messages were a blur of anxiety for Jasmine. She couldn't escape the feeling that the walls were closing in on her, that the very people who were supposed to be supportive were now part of the problem. Her classmates, the whispers in the hallways, the glances, everything felt like a weight on her shoulders. Jasmine knew she had to do something. She could feel the pressure mounting, the air thick with tension. But what could she do? She had tried standing her ground, keeping her head high, but the threats kept coming. She couldn't just let Mr. Hawkins or anyone else control her life. Was Friday afternoon when everything came to a head. The school bell rang, signaling the end of the day. Jasmine grabbed her bag, ready to head home, but as she walked toward the exit, she noticed a group of students gathered in the courtyard. They were huddled in a circle, their heads bent low, talking in hushed voices. Curiosity gnawed at her, and without thinking, Jasmine approached. As she got closer, the conversation became clearer. "Did you hear about the piano girl?" one of the girls whispered, her voice dripping with mockery. "Apparently, Mr. Hawkins wants to make sure she never plays again. And let's just say he has ways of making sure people like her know their place." Jasmine's heart skipped a beat. The mention of Mr. Hawkins made her stomach turn. Was he really behind this? Was he orchestrating all of this to break her? "He's already got the principal on his side, too." Another voice chimed in. "You really think she's going to be able to do anything after the way she humiliated him? He's too powerful." Jasmine stood there, frozen. She didn't know whether to confront them or leave before anyone saw her. But then she heard it. The name she feared most. "I heard he's not done with her," a boy's voice added. "He's going to make sure she knows who's in charge, one way or another." The words hit Jasmine like a slap in the face. Mr. Hawkins wasn't just trying to intimidate her. He was trying to ruin her. He was using his power, his influence, to destroy everything she had worked for. All because she had humiliated him at that charity event. All because she had dared to stand up for herself. Her pulse quickened, and her chest tightened with rage. She could feel the anger bubbling up inside her, but she fought to keep it under control. She wasn't going to let him win. She wasn't going to let them tear her down. Jasmine turned sharply and left the courtyard, heading straight for Mrs. Jennings' office. She needed answers. She needed a plan. When she arrived, Mrs. Jennings was sitting at her desk, flipping through some papers. The moment she saw Jasmine, she stood up, concern written all over her face. "Jasmine, what's going on?" Mrs. Jennings asked softly, her voice full of understanding. Jasmine's hands were shaking as she spoke. "They're trying to break me. I can't take it anymore. Mr. Hawkins, he's using his power to make sure I never play again. They're all in on it. I don't know what to do." Mrs. Jennings's expression hardened, her eyes narrowing in determination. "I've been hearing rumors too, and I've tried to keep you out of it, but it seems like they've escalated. You're not alone in this, Jasmine. You need to know that. But you have to fight back. Not with anger, but with your talent. Your music is your voice. That's the one thing they can't take from you." Jasmine nodded slowly, trying to calm the storm inside her. Mrs. Jennings was right. Her music was the one thing that was truly hers. It was the thing that made her unique, that made her strong. No one could take that away from her. Mrs. Jennings continued, her voice firm. "There's a concert this weekend, a charity event. I've been in touch with the organizers, and they want you to perform. This could be your chance to show everyone who you really are, but you have to stay strong. Don't let them break you." Jasmine felt a surge of hope. A concert, a chance to prove herself once again, to show them that she wasn't going to back down. It was her moment, and this time she wasn't going to let anyone, especially Mr. Hawkins, take it from her. But there was one more thing she needed to do. That night, Jasmine sat at the piano, her fingers brushing the keys. She played, but it wasn't just any piece. This was the song that had been playing in her mind ever since the first time she faced Mr. Hawkins, a song of strength, of defiance, of reclaiming her power. It was the anthem of everything she had fought for. She closed her eyes, letting the music fill her soul, letting it wash away the fear and anger. She wasn't going to let them define her anymore. She was going to play, and when she did, they would all see the truth. She was powerful, and no one could stop her. The night of the concert arrived. Jasmine stood backstage, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was full of influential people, people who had power, people who had money. But none of that mattered to her. She wasn't here for them. She was here for herself. She was here to show them that she belonged. She walked out onto the stage, the spotlight hitting her face. The crowd fell silent, and for a moment she felt a rush of nerves. But then she remembered her mother's words, Mrs. Jennings' advice. This was her moment. She sat down at the piano, her fingers hovering over the keys, and then she played. The music filled the room, filling every corner with her strength, her passion. She played with everything she had, every ounce of emotion that had built up inside her. The music was raw, powerful, and as the last note echoed through the hall, the silence that followed was deafening. Then, slowly, the applause began. At first, it was quiet, just a few claps, but then it grew louder, stronger. The room erupted in applause, and Jasmine felt the weight on her shoulders lift. She had done it. She had proven herself, but as the crowd cheered, Jasmine's eyes locked with one person in the back of the room. It was Mr. Hawkins, and this time, he wasn't smiling. Jasmine held her head high, the adrenaline pumping through her veins. She had faced him. She had faced them all, and she had won. What would happen to Mr. Hawkins now? Could Jasmine truly escape his reach?